So let's start explaining what is MCP. MCP stands for Model Context Protocol. An MCP server is created in a context where we want to execute some tools. For example, like we want to call a database that has some blog post. And we want to execute some actions like we want to list the blog posts that are in this database. Or also we want to add a new blog post or remove one. In this case, the MCP server will define different tools in order to execute these actions. And the LLM, based on the input from the user, for example, when the user says, I want to add a new blog post about this topic and with this title, then the LLM will recognize properly which is the tool from the MCP that has to be called and will assign the correct arguments in order to call this tool. Let's see then how this MCP is created. Here we are going to use this MCP library and we are going to create this instance of FastMCP. In this case here, we define here this DB file. Then we will have here a simple init database function to make sure that the database is created. In the case that's already created, this will just be skipped over. And then here we already are creating the tools. First we have a tool to get the blog post. In MCP it's very important to define properly and to write these doc strings in order to define what the tool does and also what are the arguments for this tool. For example, here we have this tool that get the blog post and the arguments are these ones. Here we have the query and here we just have like the logic of the tool. This is not so relevant for now. What's important is the get blog post, the arguments and also this description. We have two more tools, one to add blog post. In this case the arguments are title and content, both strings, and we also have the description for it. And the same with remove blog post. Finally, we have a simple helper function to format a bit better the results that we get when we list the blog post. And we create the MCP like this. Let's see now how the client is built, also the client that calls this MCP server. First, also we have this entry point of the application. Here we define the user inputs that will act a bit as if this is a chat that we are talking to the LLM, like ChatGPT or something. And for example, when we have this uncommented, we are telling this message to the LLM. Here we have one to list the blog post, another one to add a blog post, and one to remove a blog post with the ID specified. When we are here, we are initializing the session to the MCP and we are calling this function. This is very important to know which are the tools defined on the MCP. And then we become these tools here and we create the tool prompt that will be used to tell the LLM which tools are available and then choose the one that is correct in each case. We can see it here how it looks like. For example, here we have this LLM tool prompt. You are an expert tool selector and based on the user input choose the most appropriate tool. And then we have the get blog post with the arguments, the add blog post, the definition and arguments, and the same here. We can see how this tool prompt is created. This is simply also there is also this type definition from the MCP library, and we are now using description and also the name. But for other uses, when we want like more specific information, we could also use input schema, for example. And then we create the prompt and we return it. And we have seen that it looks like something like this. Once we have the prompt, we will process the user request. In this case, we remember that we told that we are going to list the blog post. So when we are here, we mix both prompts, the one with all the tools specified and the one from the user. And then we call the LLM in order to get the tool that has to be called. In this case, we can see the LLM chose the tool get blog post, and the arguments was limit with a value of 1. We can remember that this was the prompt from the user. When the tool is chosen, we call again our MCP server with the tool name and the arguments, and then the MCP server is going to properly recognize which is the tool being called and we'll call it. In this case, for example, is the get blog post, and then we do this query to the database and we return the blog post. We can now try, for example, to uncomment this, and we will add a new blog post. Here we have again the tool prompt, and here the LLM chose the add blog post with the arguments the title, World War II, and the content, what we specified here. So here the LLM has been able to know that with this message, it had to pick the right tool at the blog post, and the title also here, this was pretty specific, but it was just able to know from this string which was the title and the content. And then we called here on the backend. Here we inserted this new blog post with the title and content. And now let's see if we can show it. Now let's list the blog post again. And we can see that now there is one blog post. Now let's try to do the same, but with the remove tool. Here we see that the ID is 1, so we are going to remove the blog post with the ID of 1. Here this is called, and we see that the blog is properly removed. Then we can try again to list the blog post, and there is no blog post again.